So one of the problems with the translations we have of Plato and Aristotle into English is that often the translators seem to have made a choice for legibility and trying to make the text as understandable as possible for a contemporary audience, and trying to make the text readable as well. Because if they respected perfectly the Greek syntax, then, I've read translations of Aristotle which are not readable because the translators made the opposite decision. So Philosophy Begins in Wonder is a lovely, perhaps romantic sense of the beginning of philosophy. But, and this is drawing on the work of a friend of mine, Justin Clemens, I think the best translation I've ever found in English for what Aristotle is talking about, and also for my own experience, is simply that philosophy begins in stupefaction, which means you're not wondering, at the beauty of a flower or of a cloud or anything like that. You're stupefied, you are astonished, you're transfixed, you're paralyzed, you don't know what's going on, you're shocked, and you're scrabbling to find some kind of response to the phenomena that you're witnessing. And this could be a political phenomenon, it could be, an act of violence, it could be an ethical phenomenon, it could be somebody breaking up with you, or somebody declaring that they're in love with you. It could be the arrival of a child. It could be your experience as a young professor of the classroom, your first experience of a classroom, and actually trying to work out where your students are cognitively and culturally and trying to connect to them. But there are moments that are not so much ones of existential angst, but simply moments in which we just do not know what's going on. And at the same time, we don't accept to remain confused. We don't accept that state of confusion and bewilderment, and we're struggling to get out of that state. And for me, that idea does capture the beginning of philosophy. It's having a question that bothers you. I think that one of the kinds of encounter that can produce stupefaction is with another's idiom or another's language. So, for example, I moved to Australia when I was very young. My family emigrated to Australia when I was 7 years old. And people may think the difference between England and Australia is not that much, but in fact there's a really significant difference. And when I arrived in this playground, I was called a pom, a whinging pom. Right? That's the term, the derogatory term, in old school Australian culture for the English. I didn't even know what a whinging pom was. I didn't know what whinging was. And suddenly I was identified with this moniker, with this hostile label. So that whole moment of stupefaction and that kind of initial moment of separating out those who are normal and those who are abnormal, those who are Australian, those who are foreigners, happened through a name. And the name was Pom. A whinging pom for somebody who comes from England. Part of the actual work of research in any particular field is always undoing the evidence of those dichotomies. So to colonial and post-colonial, the names of decolonialization are added, or struggles of national liberation, or imperialism, the various different kinds of empire. So once you actually enter into the field of research and go beyond what's said on the media or what you find on social media, you find a proliferation of names, and you can start triangulating, for example, and working with more complex configurations of identity. And I think that that's actually part of the joy of research, is that suddenly the field opens up and you don't get locked into the kinds of dead ends for action or for thinking that result precisely from just employing dichotomies. I mean, of course, like any conference organizer, you have your own self-centeredness and your egotism, and you imagine that everybody's going to do a brilliant piece on your theme, refer to it in their actual presentation, and you're going to end up with this perfect jigsaw puzzle in which everything fits in, and suddenly you say, well, we've covered that topic correctly. But of course, nothing like that ever takes place. And the fact is that all of the participants who came and presented made a real effort to touch upon the theme in one way or another. And what I also really enjoyed was the fact that we got different disciplines in there. So Islamic studies, for example, anthropology, and then also sociology. And I think that even at the level of method, some of the key differences between the disciplines popped up in the question and answer sessions. That I was very happy about that. And then also, I'm also extremely happy when somebody comes up with something completely different from a tradition that I don't know that responds to a question that I have. Massimo's Campanini's work and his very painstaking and careful work on the different meanings of jihad in particular verses of the Quran was absolutely astonishing. I mean, I have to say that given that at a particular moment, he said, if you really want to understand what a struggle, what this word jihad as struggle actually means, in a particular epoch in history and in particular verses, the semantic range widens to include childbirth. I think the challenge is to come up with a concept of struggle which is dialogical, which involves a dialogue, which involves a relationship to others. So in my work, which is inspired by Machiavelli in this regard, I try to find a positive role for political conflict, a positive role for antagonism, a positive role for polemic, and in the end, for democratic debate. If you've ever actually participated in democratic debate, it's not particularly polite. It's not particularly nice. It involves a lot of name calling. It involves a lot of dismissal, disqualification of the other, that kind of thing. All kinds of tactics are used in real democratic debate. But there you have an actual structured conflict which can continue without knocking any participant out of the game completely. And so I think for me, the challenges of contemporary politics are also challenges around the meanings of words. And one of the things that philosophy does is it comes up with concepts, and when it comes up with concepts, it extends or changes the semantic range of words, and it takes certain words and says, these are really important, we need to think about these, we need to use these in our political imagination. So I think that with a word like jihad, or with the English word struggle, the key for me is to come up with a concept of struggle in which you can accept and understand the existence of the other's struggle against you, and understand what side it is of your own actions that are felt as damaging and harmful by the other, and start to accept and understand just how different you look to the other compared to how you think you look. And I think it's like, for me, it's the French got this wonderful preposition, l'envers. It's the other side, or the reverse side of your own face that you need to learn to see. And I think that this could be like a structuring moment in these ongoing political conflicts. It could be like a logical and a structural moment which allows a more fruitful and fertile argument to take place. I also think that we need to stop using euphemisms, talking about, dialogues are lovely words, discussion, conversation, like pragmatism talks about conversations, like Rorty talks about democratic conversations. And I think we need to just embrace words which reflect more adequately what happens in the realm of politics, like arguments and conflicts and polemics. In my current research, where I'm working on developing an ontology, a theory of political action, one of the founding principles comes from the great tradition of Homeric epics, which is simply that an epic poem always begins in media res, the Latin term, which basically means in the middle of things. So you have no slow introduction of characters and setting and so on. Like suddenly you're in the thick of it. You're in action, and that for me is also a fundamental principle for an ontology of action. That is that one cannot easily stipulate the first action nor the origin of an action, and that one must understand all actions as themselves reactions to something that happened before. So in the beginning, we have affectivity. We're affected by somebody else's action. And I mean, the simple terms that I use for it at the moment is I just think, in the beginning, you get shoved, you get pushed, you get shoved out of the position that you thought was yours. And it's like musical chairs, right? So the start of an ontology of action is a violent displacement. You're shoved out of the position that you thought that was yours. Somebody else acted. You don't know who. You're trying to work out who it was. And you act back whilst you're still disorientated. So that's the first point. And the second point is there's this wonderful notion in Rousseau's work. And it's a term which expresses multiple causal factors coming in and converging upon one particular point. And the French verb is concourir à. So you'll have free will that participates and contributes to a movement that is also initiated by nature or by impulse. So with this idea of concourir à, or to share in or to contribute to converge with, what's important to note is Rousseau is not naturalizing particular political actions. He's not claiming that they have a ground in nature and that they're expressing the will of God or anything like that. So this is something that one finds often in a political philosophy, even in liberalism, for example. I mean, Smith makes this move, is that a particular kind of political action is justified by the claim that it is natural, that it is born in human nature, or that it is born in the nature of collectives, as in like decision theory, game theory, rational choice theory. Okay, there's a nature that is posited through particular arguments, and then the particular kind of political action that the philosopher is prescribing or recommending is given that shape. So what Rousseau is doing is something far more specific. He's saying that there are particular situations in which you have a convergence of the will and of a particular impulse within a particular human's mind, right? Or when it comes to laws, he's very much influenced by Montesquieu and l'esprit des lois. And there he insists on the specificity of a people's mores, of their customs, of their traditions, of their habits, of their culture. And so he says that a law must be tuned to, it must be appropriate to a particular people's customs and habits and their way of thinking. Otherwise, it's going to dysfunction completely. So that's another way in which a particular political action can be fine-tuned to a collective, right? And that task is in the hands of the Legislative Assembly, but also in the hands of the legislator, the one who actually, the group or the person who draws up the Constitution. So what's fascinating about Rousseau's concept of free will, and this is in the second discourse, the discourse on the origins of inequality, is we act freely, not when we spontaneously choose to negate any option presented to us naturally by our mind or by our passions and invent some alternative route of action. So it's not pure negation, it's not pure spontaneity when we just come up with an idea and act without any kind of predeterminations. It's actually cooperation. It's when, with your free will, you choose one of the passions that are present in your mind and you decide to go with that one rather than with another one. Okay? And so you act freely precisely when you act alongside with the impetus that's coming to you from nature, which is an unfree impetus. He has one of his most difficult and controversial concepts, which is the generic will. So a law that is passed by a parliament or a legislative assembly is only genuinely a law when it expresses the will of the people, la volonté du peuple, and it creates a new relationship between the people understood in one aspect and the people understood in another aspect. So the people as citizens and as agents are legislating through the Legislative Assembly, and they are bringing about a change upon themselves as subjects. So they play two different roles in the creation of a law. And the idea is that the generic will is what remains when all of the differences between what people think are subtracted. And so one of the things that Rousseau recommends, for example, because he's the general will, sorry, when I use the term generic, I'm referring to Badiou's interpretation of it. The general will is a concept that is opposed to the phenomenon of factionalism, whereby you have a small part of the people who separate and form a body, a corporation, and then they push the particular interests of that corporation as the general interests of the nation. So they distort them, they disguise them, and they downgrade and dismiss the particular interests of any other factions, and they promote a vision of justice which favors their interests. So this is a phenomenon that philosophers have seen occurring in politics from the ancient Greeks onwards. Aristotle has a great theory of factionalism in the back of his Politics. And the general will is, as I said, a concept that's designed to overcome these regions and parts and their distortion of the political field, whereby they claim to be metonymies. They're parts that claim to be the whole. Okay? And I think that what's more important when you look at phenomena that are called riots is to actually look at what's positive that's happening inside those particular movements, like what's being invented, what particular places are being targeted. Rage is not blind. Anger is not blind either. There are very particular targets that are being taken. There was one particular, I remember somebody complaining on the news and saying that their car got burnt on the side of a protest march. And it was a Porsche. It was a Porsche. It wasn't a Renault Clio. It wasn't an old car. It was a Porsche that was burnt. Right? I mean, there's a reason behind this. It's the police cars that are being burnt as well. And I think that there's a fundamental political intuition that is present when you have outbreaks of political violence amongst the agents, amongst the people who are involved. And that is simply that there is a balance of power in politics. And that power often comes down to a question of force. And we've seen this in particular moments in history when there have been revolutions. It's been because there has been a massive swing in public opinion, and there has been a swing at the level of the number of people who are willing to go out into the streets and who are willing to stop work and who are willing to say this can no longer continue. And I think that people who critique protests sometimes are quite right when they say that group of people in that particular public square don't represent the majority of the population. Right? Though you look, and that's why you have newspapers doing sociological surveys of the people who go to Nuit Debout and just saying this is not representative. It becomes very complicated because you need to look at who has access to means of expression, who has the right kind of culture and training to use those means of expression, who is being heard, and who's having options, who can actually put options in front of themselves to think about how a country can go forwards. With regard to the challenges of unemployment, environmental challenges, challenges in terms of international relations. Okay, but I think that for me, I mean, it's not a subject that I'm an expert in, but methodologically, thinking of people involved in either protest marches or in riots as deprived of X, that's all very well, but what also needs to be done is to think of what they do actually have. So one of the axioms that came out of my study of the November 2005 disturbances was very simple. It was, these riots are not mute. They're quite articulate. You just need to learn how to listen. And I remember one particular man who was interviewed, he must have been in his mid-20s, by a journalist up in Clichy-sous-Bois, and he was just saying, people don't understand. I feel like I'm drowning. I've been trying so hard to get out of this situation. I've sent my CV to 100 different positions. I've never had one response, even though my CV fits the profile of the jobs that are being offered. I've been retrained. I've trained again. I've been on and off unemployment benefits. I feel like I'm drowning. So either you can hear that and you understand the force of that metaphor, I feel like I'm drowning, or you dismiss it, right? But those riots were not mute. there was a very articulate message coming through them. Basically, the theory of today is the practice of tomorrow. It's that simple. There's nothing that's being done politically right now that hasn't been thought of already and conceptualized. I mean, this is not to say that, that ideas always precede practice, but rather to say that many of the practices that we're engaged in nowadays are antique. They're very ancient practices. And they come with an enormous luggage of ideas. And those ideas that circulate, yes, you're always going to have this simplification that occurs in the heat of an event and in a moment. And, a political message has to be very simple to get across. But what are the words that are chosen? And how are they used? So in the most interesting moments in political history, such as the French Revolution, Sieyès, for example, asks the question, what is the third estate? The third estate is the nation. Okay, so not the king and the nobles, not the clergy who were the second estate, but all of those who were grouped into the third estate, the peasants, the petty bourgeoisie, the shopkeepers, the artisans, etc., etc. All of those, he claimed, this group, which numerically is by far the largest, it's the nation. And by doing that, he gave a completely different sense to what a nation was. So there's a word that was relatively new in the sense of designating the political body, right? It's not a kingdom, it's not a city-state, it's not a republic, it's a nation, okay? And he wrote this incredibly influential and very well-timed pamphlet, What's the Third Estate? Okay, which got took up and printed and reprinted, and people read it voraciously because they were in a time of political trouble and they needed answers. So to multiply the names and the concepts that are used to understand politics, it's a question of timing, and it's a question of broadcasting, and it's a question of education. And certain names, this is a thing that I remain absolutely convinced of, certain names and certain concepts are far more in tune with what's actually going on the ground. So in politics, as in healthcare, as in education, we are grappling with contemporary problems. Right? We're grappling with contemporary challenges. A different kind of population, different kind of generations are presenting different kinds of social problems that need to be fixed. How do we fix them? With ancient solutions, using very old words. Like the word nation, now it's old, it's 200 years old. It doesn't have the same efficacy as it used to have. So we need new words, right? And those new words are going to be born out of precisely these political struggles in which people are trying to find the appropriate political language to fit their experience. And that political language has to be encapsulated in simple maxims, principles, and slogans for it to be transmitted easily. But at the same time, it can also be very complicated. So, I saw this with my work on the leveller agitators, who were elected representatives of the New Model Army, the parliamentary army that fought with Cromwell and his son-in-law Ireton at their head. And they came up with very simple slogans. We're fighting for a settlement for the war. That's very simple. We want settlement, right? Or pay us our arrears, pay us our salaries that you haven't paid for a year. But those simple slogans went alongside a very complicated and very subtle political discourse that completely redrew the map of who should be allowed to vote in England, of who actually counted as somebody who's contributing to the greatness of England. It redrew the map in terms of what were the sources of legitimacy of political power, of who could actually act in politics. So you can have simple slogans clustered around important terms, like one of the great manifestos of the leveller agitators in the New Model Army was called An Agreement of the People. There you have it, the people. 1647. It comes forwards as a new signifier, as a new word that encapsulates people's hopes and their dreams. Lacan said a very similar thing. He says, an action occurs when a new signifier emerges. There's no such thing. An action is not just a physical transformation. It's not just a shift in relationships. An action is always accompanied at a symbolic level, whether that's stipulated to be intentions that are attributed to somebody, or whether it's at the level of a maxim, as in Kant's sense, but an action that actually changes things is accompanied by the emergence of a new signifier.